in a compressed period of time. This is something that is going to continue, probably will accelerate with the manner in which technology is continuing to change our business. I think this presentation is one that I've been giving for nearly 20 years in one form or another, because behavioral finance is something that leapt onto the scene. You probably remember back in 2002, it was the hot topic. I honestly, though, think behavioral finance is one of those topics that really was a little bit ahead of its time and is now really coming into fruition for financial advisors to put into practice with their clients to drive an outstanding, meaningful outcome in better family lives. So this presentation is one that we've been giving for a few years now, and I think it also puts into frame the manner in which the pandemic has shaped our thoughts in the financial services. So we'll talk about investor behavior, why this is important now more than ever before. We'll also talk about tools and resources that you can use as financial advisors with your clients, because that's really what I view my job as. My job is to develop tools and resources to make your lives easier, to have better conversations with clients, to drive them towards a better outcome. And then, of course, we'll close up with some communication tips, talk about words that work, because the vernacular we use with our clients is definitely important. If they don't understand what we're talking about, it's never going to be put into practice. And we live in a world where in our little sphere, we can have a conversation in almost in an entirely different language, and a layman will not understand anything we say. So we always have to be mindful when we're employing concepts, strategies, or really anything, and how we're conveying it to our clients, because if they don't understand it, it's basically worthless. So investors, as we all know, are human. This is somewhat trite. However, it's very true. You look at economics, and economics has this presumption, and they actually have a name for it. It's Homo economicus. You break that down to a shorter title, and it's a unit that they call an econ. So economics portends that an econ is supposed to act in a very specific way. So the way an econ is supposed to act is they're supposed to act rationally to begin with. They're always supposed to act rationally. They're supposed to take all the information that's out there, metabolize it, and put it into their own self-interest in a way that moves forward. Now you think about that for a second. Do people always act in their own self-interest? Absolutely not. You look at the amount of information that's out there, and it is outstanding. So the amount of information that's out there is way too much for most individuals to digest and put into anything that's going to be positive for their financial plan. One thing that I like to look at is the amount of time we spend as a country looking at our devices. Does anyone want to guess the average amount of time an American currently spends looking at a device every day? You're really close with 6 hours. It's 6 hours and 58 minutes, bringing it to about 7 hours every single day in front of a device. So you think about your clients who are picking up their smartphone constantly, and they're picking up their smartphone over 60 times a day. So this is a habitual behavior that they do, that they take that information that's on the internet. And of course, the stuff that's on the internet oftentimes is really terrible, stuff that you shouldn't be taking and applying to your financial life. And really, it makes your job easier, because we know investors are only human and they're emotional. They're not always rational. They take all that morass of information and cause a mess. There is a disconnect between the expertise that we have and what clients tend to do on their own. So doing it yourself, I think that's a great example of why they shouldn't. But really, honestly, the root problem is their own behavior. And the problem also comes down to where we see the largest amount of losses for our clients. They're during periods of crisis. 70% of losses occur during crisis. Now that's an important thought, because our job has changed fundamentally from being numbers driven, economics driven, to people management driven. Managing behavior is by far the most important manner of an advisor working with a client, much more so than the X's and O's as far as putting a stock portfolio together or an asset allocation. And people are becoming much more attuned to this. If you're not in concert with their behavior and how they're acting, it's going to be devastating to your practice, because right now you can pick up your smartphone, you can use AI. Many people feel that AI can build much better portfolios than any person can. So we have to connect with our clients on a much different level. Also, those programs on our smartphones and those asset allocations do nothing in terms of turmoil. When periods of bad happen, Clients need leadership and guidance from their financial advisor. And in my opinion, that is the biggest facet of what we bring to the table for our clients, and especially in those crisis periods. Because what happens during those crisis periods, and we're bombarded with it, we can look back over the last 3 or 4 years and you can jump crisis to crisis on the media, because every single day it's something new, and every single day it's something that can freak a client out and derail their financial plan. And what happens in someone's mind, and the reason that this number is so pervasive, is because it's biologically rooted. This is something we're hardwired to have these losses during any difficult point in time because of how we're constructed biologically, what goes on in our brain. So you go back to the beginning of human history and you think about the largest threats to the quote unquote caveman. And when I say that, usually what happens is you have this image evoked in your mind of this saber-toothed tiger that's attacking a person, where in reality, very few saber-toothed tigers probably ever attacked a person, and definitely wasn't the biggest threat to them. You want to guess what the biggest threat to humankind has been throughout history? Mosquitoes is probably a good bet, but I would say other people, and probably more specifically ourselves. So we're constantly in situations, especially from a social standpoint, being in front of other people, making decisions around other people socially, and it's constantly putting us in this biological predicament where our brain needs to decipher what is a threat and what isn't. So as the media promulgates all of these crises, some of them manufactured, some of them real, it puts clients in this biological situation. Because what happens in your brain when you're faced with any threat is you need to determine, one, is it a threat? And the system that we have to determine whether or not something is a legitimate threat is a really bad system. And it has to be by design, because if this is an immediate threat, we have to be able to respond quickly to it. So the system in our brain that deals with this, and you've probably heard of this term before, it's called the amygdala. The amygdala, the lizard brain, this is our rudimentary, our reactive side of our brain that kicks in anytime we need to identify a threat. Now, for investing decisions or anything complex, that is the last decision process that you want to have kick in. What's much more preferred is decision making in your prefrontal cortex, which is the area of your brain that's problem solving. It deals with comprehensive planning. Anything complicated in your prefrontal cortex is going to decipher it, make a rational decision around it, tends to be the better system when we talk about making investment decisions. What happens is people don't understand the threats that they're faced with. They view them as legitimate threats when they're not. The amygdala kicks in, the biology all of a sudden in your hippocampus, you're flooded with all these hormones. And these hormones, noradrenaline, adrenaline, go into your system and you have this visceral response. And what occurs is your heart rate, your breathing accelerates, your blood pressure skyrockets, your muscles all of a sudden get blood flowed to them because we're going into that fight response. This is the acute anxiety response. It's the same thing. It's fight, it's flight. There's actually two others that aren't oftentimes spoken about. There's also freeze and fawn. When we're talking about fight or flight, that's the one we want to avoid, because when those biological changes occur, we are not in any mode to make any decision about anything financial. So we need to recognize that and insulate against it. And I think that's one of the biggest jobs of a financial advisor right now, is just help clients avoid that type of decision making, because historically it has led to some disastrous results, this just being one of them. And of course, you can look at the statistics and you can look at the rates of return and you can look at them. And I know every single year, and you're probably familiar with the study here, behavioral finance is rooted very much in the groundwork done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. But there's an organization that's kind of taken the flag since 1992. It's an organization called Dalbar. You're probably familiar with Dalbar. Dalbar does the quantitative analysis of investor behavior every single year. And what this study looks at is it looks at the average individual investor and what their rates of returns, with all the warts that come with it, mistakes and emotion that go in the decision, and compare it to what the indices return. Which one does better by and large? Is it the average investor or is it the indice? Indice. Every single year they do this study. I don't believe there has been one year where there has been the average investor outperforming the index. And it's because of those issues, which to us, we see that, and we see years like 2021, which actually was a really bad year when we talk about the quantitative analysis of investor behavior, because it was the third worst year that they ever analyzed going back to 1992. You can take those years in every single instance and look at them and say, kind of shrug them off. Well, that's only a 10% difference between what the investor returned and what the index returned. It's not the end of the world. However, behavior and investing over time, it does become a big deal, because you look at that $100,000 that you put in 1992. You want to guess, as an average investor, and your average investor returns, if you put that $100,000 in the market and 100,000, what would you get today? Back from 1992 to today, what do you think the actual return was for the average investor? Not as a percent, but as a dollar amount. 100,000 in. Anyone want to wager a guess? $789,000. 789,000. You're probably thinking pretty good. I put $100,000 in. I now have 789. You want to guess what the index did? That same $100,000. $2,082,000. That's a delta of $1.3 million. That is a material amount of money that will make a meaningful impact on someone's life. And it's all because of the decisions they make, all because of the emotions that played into it. So safeguarding our clients from making these compounding decisions, I think that's the key there, is these are habitual. They add up over time. It's definitely important that we safeguard against this every single year. Even though the marginal rates of return may seem small, compounded over time, it is meaningful. So this behavior is something we have to look at. And it's something that, as it becomes habitual, also erodes. Yes, sir. So they look at the actual returns per a survey of investors in different investments. I think that's probably the most concise way to explain it. And then they stack it up against the index. I can't go deeper into the methodology because I've never sat next to someone at Dalbar to actually do it. But basically, they're looking at their actual returns over time. So it has to be retrospective. But anyway, habitual. This is something that over time, our decisions, not only from investing returns and making blunders in our portfolios, it also adds up into our savings. And unfortunately, what we've seen since ERISA back in 1974 is we've changed fundamentally as a retirement system from having a spoon-fed retirement system, something where there's a lot of responsibility placed on every single individual to make sure that they've saved enough diligently for retirement. And I think the litmus test, as you look over the experiment, really hasn't gone as great as we would hope. I think the difference, though, when working with an advisor is completely opposite. But we look at the average American, and I can recall coming into the industry, and you probably heard this same metaphor used for the American retirement and how healthy it is. It was talked about as a three-legged stool. Everyone heard that analogy before. What are the three legs of the American retirement stool? Pensions, Social Security, private savings. Yep, so those were the three things that you needed equilibrium and balance across to have a healthy retirement. So you revisit that now in 2023 and you look, do we have a healthy three-legged stool? Is it wobbly or is it stable? You look at each one of those legs, and we've done a horrendous job collectively as a society preparing for retirement. So you look at them. Social Security. Social Security, if you look at Social Security and take a step back, Social Security is probably the ubiquitous thing in the American retirement experience. It's the one thing when you go through it, you have control on, and most people, when they do make their decision to file for Social Security, don't do a great job of it. So United Planners did a study on this, and they looked at how people did in filing their Social Security benefits, and they estimated the percent that filed an optimal Social Security strategy. Does anyone want to guess the percent that they estimated that people filed an optimal Social Security strategy? You're 1% off. It was 4%. 4% of people file an optimal Social Security strategy. Now, I have a little bit of an issue with that statistic. First off, I don't like terms like optimal, because what is optimal? I think one of the keys of Social Security planning is it's specific, it's individual. It's really difficult to say optimal, but in their sense, they mean it's cumulative benefits over a lifetime, which for some people really might not be the end result that they're trying to drive. But you go further into their statistic, and I think it becomes a little more meaningful when they talk about it in terms of dollars, because 4% is a percent. It doesn't really mean anything. They estimate that that 4% equates to $3.4 trillion of lost retirement income. Now, 3.4 trillion, again, I have another issue with that, because $1 trillion is something most people will never be able to comprehend. It's this macro amount of money that's really difficult to wrap your hands around. But also, you look at this further, and they break it down to household income. And I think there it starts to become a little more meaningful, because by not filing an optimal strategy, they portend that they're missing out per household on $111,000 of retirement income. Most people in retirement having that $111,000 of extra income is meaningful. So Social Security, the one thing we probably really can control at the time that you do it, most people are making mistakes. There's a lot of value for financial advisors still to talk about Social Security. One of the things I think we tend to get is we get beaten over our head on certain topics. And since Social Security has been a topic for the last really decade for us, it's something we view as old hat. However, we still see that demographic tidal wave as a reality. We've all heard the 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every single day. Right now, we're cresting. We're at 12,000 baby boomers every single day. So more people are making this fresh decision that they've never thought about, and they absolutely need help. So I wouldn't overlook Social Security still as a major component and something that should be addressed with clients. We can help you out with that. We have great Social Security collateral, or really any company that you have Social Security collateral with is something you should take a look at as a necessary element of expertise. But we look at the other side of the equation when we talk about the stool. We also have defined benefit pension plans. And that's probably the biggest change with ERISA, gravitating from the DB world, all of a sudden this defined contribution world. We look in the 80s and the percent of people that had defined benefit pension plans. Does anyone want to guess the private sector, the percent of people that relied on defined benefit plans as their sole source of retirement income other than Social Security? 60 to 80%. So most people during that time had that spoon-fed retirement. You now fast forward to today. Do you want to guess the percent of private sector workers that rely on the DB plan as their sole source of retirement income? 3%. If you add in defined contribution plans, you had that on the last one. It actually jumps to 12% when you have them in tandem. So it's not terrible. And then we look at our final stool, the one that also we have a lot of control over that is habitual, and that's savings. So this is our private savings in our retirement assets. You look at the baby boomers. Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies every year does this survey, and they estimate the amount the average baby boomer has saved for retirement. Do you want to guess what the average baby boomer has saved for retirement? So they're on the doorstep of retirement. What do you think that amount of money is? $202,000. $202,000, which supposedly is supposed to last you 20, 30, 40 years in retirement. So our stool, all of a sudden, only 7% of people can access all three of those legs. And those that can probably have a really wobbly stool anyway, because that private savings element, how they file for Social Security weighs in to what that actually looks like. Now, this does bleed into what our conception is of financial wellness. And this is another one that's really difficult to wrap our arms around because most people have no concept of what financial wellness is. We did focus groups and we asked people, given that terminology, what does it mean? They didn't know. They didn't know. It's up to us in some circumstances to prescribe what things mean. And I think for us, a lot of times, what this means is cash flow, it's budgeting, making sure you're putting enough into savings, that you're adequately controlling your risks through insurance. Financial wellness in a septic sense means something to us. But again, this is something that's very individual. I think for a lot of our clients, they probably have a clearer concept than the average public, but their kids may have no idea whatsoever what this looks like. And this is where behavioral finance comes in. And I think this is where taking all these things, this morass of different issues, and the innovation we've seen in technology in our industry really creates a potent strategy. Because we can look at these issues and we can put them into real time through goals-based planning, more so than we ever have. You can look at all of the array of different technology that's available. And previous to having that available, if you were talking to a client about a behavioral finance mistake or a bias, it was really difficult to pin it down. Now, with how the technology is employed, we can actually see it almost in real time. The tools we have today are so much better than we had 20 years ago. It's just framing it in a goals-based approach, using the right technology, and becomes much more potent for clients to implement. But there's other issues as well. And I think these are the ones that are impossible to implement in some type of app or through technology. AI will never be there when things are bad. And that is the role of the financial advisor. We need to be there when things are bad to provide guidance and leadership on what clients can do. The best financial advisors in our industry do the best in the worst times. It's almost universal. When things get bad, they grow their business, they do the best for their clients because they're able to shepherd them through difficulty. Now, it is another thing where I think we owe it to our clients. And I can remember back in 2008, prior to the pandemic, I was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, staying at the worst possible hotel by the airport. No one would ever want to stay there. I don't know why anyone would ever. However, I walked down to the lobby one morning and there's a queue of people out the door trying to get a room at this hotel. And the reason they're trying to get a room at this hotel is there's an airplane parked at Philadelphia Airport, which was the last air fatality in the United States on a commercial airliner. It was Southwest Flight 1380. Southwest Flight 1380, if you remember it, what happened was they were flying from Newark, New Jersey down to Dallas, Texas, and a piece of the engine cowling, the ring around the engine, broke off, struck the side of the plane. The lady that was sitting there literally was getting sucked out of the airplane. I'm sure if you were in that cabin, you were probably freaked out. It was probably all kinds of pandemonium, masks falling from the ceiling, people freaking out. But you go to the cockpit and you listen to the voice cockpit recorder and the interchange between the pilot and air traffic control, and you would never guess that there was ever an emergency on that flight or that pandemonium was in the cabin behind them, because this was Tammy Jo Schultz behind the wheel of this plane. She was the first naval combat aviator that was a woman. This is the person you want to have flying the plane. She was going through the checklist with her first officer. It was controlled. She did everything that she needed to do, didn't miss a beat. They landed that plane, only one person lost their life. You contrast that to the previous air fatality in the United States to that point in time, and it was a Colgan Air flight going from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo, New York. I guess the parable is don't fly out of Newark, but this flight, they also have the cockpit recorder and they're hearing the pilots talk before the flight. And what the pilots are talking before the flight is they've never thrown through an ice storm. There's an ice storm between them and Buffalo. They take off, they freak out, things go awry, they crash the plane, 50 people lose their life. Chaos, uncertainty are going to pop up. Being prepared for our clients and understanding that a big part of our role is being there when things are bad is extremely important. It's very important to highlight our value. We do create a lot of checklists and directives, and I think we can take a similar approach to the airline industry. When something goes bad, knowing what to do makes a big difference. A couple of my favorite pieces that we have, one deals with the death of a loved one, because most financial advisors, they've gone through difficulty with their clients and had them cry in their office before, and usually it's because someone passed away or someone got divorced. Those are two of the universal things that we tend to see throw advisors off. And a lot of advisors don't have prescribed processes for those events. So it tends to be an ad hoc reaction, very reactive, can ruin your day. But if you have an organized process and a way to drive clients to a better result with this, we see a completely different outcome. So we have two checklists on both of those that I think make a big difference. But really any issue that you run across, being that beacon of leadership for your clients is important. The second one is people are going to live a lot longer than they think they are, because not only have we seen a revolution in technology, we have seen a massive revolution in longevity in a very short period of time. Historically, we've never seen anything like this. You go back to the beginning of human history, the very first person to today. Do you want to guess what average life expectancy was across our existence as a species? 29 years old. You look at celebrities that are 29, Justin Bieber stands out in my mind. He was the senior citizen as a human being going back to day one. Now you fast forward to 1918, and this is really when the revolution started to begin. 1918, our last pandemic prior to coronavirus, the Spanish influenza. Do you want to guess what life expectancy was in 1918? Actually didn't move all that much. It went to 47. 47 was life expectancy in 1918. Putting that into celebrity terms, that's DJ Khaled, that's Reese Witherspoon, and Luke Bryan. So they were the senior citizens going back to 1918. But now you go from 1918 to today, and life expectancy is nowhere near age 47. We have seen a massive revolution thanks to innovation in medicine, sanitation, food safety. All of these things have come together to create a life expectancy that's almost boundless when you look at it. There was a Time magazine issue, and you might have seen it, had a really cute baby on it. It was February 2015. The proclamation in that Time magazine issue was that baby was born on planet Earth today, and they're going to live to age 142. The Wall Street Journal the very next week said that's hogwash. It's not 142, it's 150. And now there's a guy in Palo Alto, an Ivy League professor at Stanford. He says it's 200. So the question is, how long can someone possibly live? Now, the oldest verified person, does anyone want to guess their age? 122. 122, and her name was Jean Calment out of France. Now, the interesting thing about her, she smoked a cigarette after every meal. She had dessert and then would smoke a cigarette. But the interesting thing about her is there's a lot of controversy around Jean Calment, because there's a group of people that feels she wasn't even Jean Calment when she passed away. And this is something we have to be mindful of. Identity theft. There are people that thought she passed away in her 90s and her daughter was masquerading as her until 122 to continue to get her checks and live off of her means. So identity theft is a big one, and fraud is a major one. You look at decision making and emotion and getting those weird emails that we see come in that are saying that either we won money or our packages arrived, click on this link. Fraud is pervasive. It's everywhere. Something when you're dealing with older people is being mindful of that. And I think one of the core values for financial advisors is protecting their assets. And that's a big component of it. We do a lot of presentations on fraud. And these presentations are great because it definitely demonstrates the power of your advice and how you're watching out for your clients. Kind of digressing a little bit off behavioral finance, but I think that's important. Also, you look at how we view this in our client base. We're dealing with older clients. One of my favorite questions to ask around the country, I'm always trying to beat my record. Who here knows someone that's 85 years old or older? How about 90? How about 95? How about 100? How about 105? Okay, all the hands, how old? 107. 107 years old. My record, and I've tied it on 3 separate occasions, twice in Southern California, once in Richmond, Virginia, was 113 years old. So this is something where if you look across the room, when I was at age 95 or 100, more than half of you still had your hands up, because this is a reality. Living that long is important in the planning process. And if you do only have $202,000, planning for that 30, 40, 50-year retirement may be a reality at some point in time. So this is something we can't lose sight of. It's something that people overlook and something that's important for us as planners to implement. And behavioral finance goes a long way in helping this because it works. We know behavioral finance works when we put it in the right context. And I think that best context would be goals-based as far as implementation, but also it's something that we've seen proof is in the pudding. There are over 6 Nobel Prizes around behavioral finance. And we all think about it as being invented in 2002 with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. That's not true at all. This is going back to 1759 and Adam Smith and his theory of moral sentiments. He was writing about it back then because it's intuitive, so it's something we understand. But the field itself, the award was won in 2002. The legwork for it was in the 1970s, and it had nothing to do with finance. Actually was commissioned by the Israeli military around prospect theory and selecting the right type of people for military application. Daniel Kahneman never took a course in economics at all. This is the convergence of psychology and economics and even neuroscience now to help us with our clients. So this is a field that's very potent when we put it in place properly. And a lot of times when we're framing this out, it's constructed around the biases. And the biases are probably the bulk of the most useful information when we're talking about behavioral finance, because they're archetypes. We see all of these different actions that are contained in these biases. We see ourselves do it on a regular basis. We see it reflective in our clients on a regular basis, and it's things that we can point out. So we'll cover some of them, and there's over 25 of them. So there's no way I can cover all of them throughout the course of this presentation. We'll probably cover some of the ones that you usually aren't as familiar with, but are equally as important. And the first one is cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is something that we run across almost on a daily basis. And this is that strange feeling that you get when you hold one value, one set of beliefs, but yet you operate under a different execution or a different way. And I think Hollywood is a great example of this. This one's kind of hard to see in some daily occurrences, but you look at Hollywood. Who here is familiar with The Sopranos? Okay, Sopranos. Tony Soprano. You look at Tony Soprano, who's the hero. He's the protagonist of the Sopranos show. But you look at his morals. You look at his ethics. He is a piece of trash. He's a terrible human being. He kills people. He's the head of a mafia family. But yet, Hollywood wraps us around to root for Tony Soprano. He is the anti-hero. But that's cognitive dissonance. We can't stand the way this person acts, but yet we find ourselves rooting for him. It's that feeling. It's really difficult to pin down that frames cognitive dissonance. Where it's much easier to see in financial application is in decision making. If you look at behavioral finance at its root, it is about decision making. If you can make good judgment using sound information, you not only have a great recipe for an awesome life, but you can make great decisions. Problem is people don't. They make the wrong decisions, choosing between 2 sets of alternatives. You select the wrong one. This is that feeling of buyer's remorse that you get. It's something we see a lot. Also, you look at this, and I think another application of it, and you may see this in your family or even in your own personal circumstance, addiction. Addiction has a lot of cognitive dissonance that comes along with it. You think about smoking as a good example. We all know in this room that smoking is terrible for you. You do it long enough, it's a high probability that it will lead to your death or give you cancer. But yet, people that smoke continue to smoke thinking that they're not the one that's going to get cancer. It's never going to be an issue for them. And they dismiss and rationalize their behavior. You ever know anyone that struggles with addiction? It's that rationalization. That's that cognitive dissonance that people go forward with. And in the investing world, it's sticking with an investment that we know is poor. It's that buyer's remorse. So this is one to watch out for. Usually almost always surfaces when we're at that decision point and we're making choices between those two sets of alternatives. It's easy to see from an outsider's perspective, but when you're moving forward with it yourself, very difficult to pin down. This next one, social conformity, this one is extremely powerful in our society. There probably is not a more powerful source in our society than social conformity, because we all want to fit in. We don't want to be that nail that's sticking up that gets pounded down. So you look at social conformity in investing, and I think it's very obvious. It's going with the herd. It's the herd mentality, even though we may identify that this is the absolute worst thing we can do for our financial lives. But you also look at examples of it, and there's a great example in Candid Camera, and you might have seen this video. There's an individual that gets in an elevator, and everyone in the elevator is facing towards the back of the elevator. That person gets in and they're kind of spooked. They don't know what's going on. But as you see the video, they will eventually reorient themselves slowly to facing in the same direction. We're herd creatures. Another one is Vegas. They put this velvet rope line up in Vegas on Las Vegas Boulevard. And what always happens for no reason, we're all programmed to line up. People will line up behind this rope for absolutely no reason. Social conformity is huge from a psychological standpoint and from a decision-making standpoint. Even masks, you think about the pandemic. If you're the only person in the room without a mask on, or conversely, you're the only one in the room without a mask, there's a lot of pressure in that situation. So we've all experienced this over the last several years. Another one, and I think this one's big for our practices, and really anything that you're doing in a commercial sense, framing is always something that's extremely important, because this is the root. This is the bedrock of marketing. And you think about how much money is put into marketing efforts and how psychologically we're constantly being twisted and turned to act in a specific way. A great example of this, one of my favorites, is the grocery store. You go into the grocery store, you may not realize it, but when you step into that threshold in the grocery store, you're the victim of decades of experience to break down your consumer behavior to buy as much as you possibly can in that grocery store. It is meticulously designed to do this. When you first go into a grocery store, what section do you almost universally find yourself in? Produce. You end up in produce. You probably walk in the door, you go to the right, you're in the produce section. The produce section is intentional because the produce section is the most image rich. It's vibrant colors, it's produce, it's succulent. It gets your mind primed to break down the decision-making factor. And they do little tricks. One of my favorite is the Safeway up near where I live, and you probably have a similar one. They spray water onto the vegetables and fruits, and they make like a little thunderstorm sound when they do it. When you think about that, it's actually probably for most of those fruits and vegetables the worst thing you can do, because it promotes spoiling for a lot of them. But yet they do it because it breaks down our decision making. And then the way they frame the rest of the store, you have produce on the far right. What do you think's on the far left? It's either going to be dairy or the bakery, because what they want you to do is they want you to walk the entire store. And as you walk the entire store, they're very intentional on placing end caps and high value items in spots where you would buy them. Also, even the way that they sell certain products, we know this to be true because we see it. I've become a big fan of ground turkey. You probably have as well, because beef is so expensive. But you look at ground turkey and the way it's expressed. It's either 95% fat-free, 93% fat-free, or 85%. It's never 7% fat, 15% fat. It's always expressed in that manner. And it's framing. And we're victims in all kinds of issues when it comes to framing. Another one that I love to pick on is wine. Wine is something that has a specific ceremony attached to it. And you look at wine and you look at the ceremony that's attached to it, how much people will pay for this ceremony, it's astounding. So you look at wine, and my favorite one is blind taste tests, because wine always comes in the glass bottle, and in that glass bottle is a cork. The cork itself is something that spoils over time. So if you're looking at just preserving your investment in a wine bottle, really the last thing you want in it is a cork, because it taints the wine over time. Now the alternative, is the box of wine or the can of wine, which any wine connoisseur would poo-poo because that is for somebody else. It's not for the high-end wine person. But you do the taste test. The people that prefer, do you think it's the bottle or do you think they prefer the can? They prefer the can. The can scientifically is better for the wine. It allows less oxygen ingress. It doesn't have that problem with the cork. But yet people will pay astronomical amounts of money to have that ceremonial aspect of their wine, or even where it's placed on the shelf comes into play. Another favorite of mine, and I don't mean to stick with alcohol too much, but Whistle Pig. Is anyone familiar with Whistle Pig? Now, Whistle Pig, if you may not know, it is a ultra high-end brand of whiskey, and it's a new brand of whiskey. It came onto market in 2010. Also, as Coloradans, you may not know that Whistle Pig was named out of Colorado because the owner, a guy named Raj Bhakta, was going on a hike in Colorado, and he was hiking by somebody and he said, watch out for the Whistle Pig. And a whistle pig is a groundhog. So that's what it's named after. But basically what Raj did is he bought a farm in Vermont, and in that farm in Vermont, he creates this ultra high-end premium whiskey. He brought out his first rye in 2015 as a 10-year product. So if you do the quick math on that, I opened in 2010, I introduced a rye in 2015, and it's 10 years aged. How does that work? Because he was buying another product. He was buying another product. It was called Alberta Premium, and it was a rye blended whiskey. He bought a component of that, put it in his bottle, and marked it up by like 300%. You could buy a shot of Whistle Pig for what it costs to buy an entire bottle of Alberta Premium, but people did it because of the way that it's framed. Marketing, framing, and even in our practices, the way we present ourselves to our client is oh so important. The choices that we provide them, very important. The way we use and communicate with them in all facets. Marketing, framing is something we have to be mindful of in our own situation. But really what it comes down to when we talk about behavioral finance is two methods of thinking. And I've already covered this. System number one, instinct and emotion. That's the amygdala. That's the knee-jerk reactions. That's what we want to stay away from. System number two is what happens in our prefrontal cortex. That's rational thinking. That's comprehensive planning. That's where we want to make our investment decisions. But as we know, people continue to make the decisions in system number one at their own detriment. Now, when we talk about this, we can see other empirical evidence that points to how this is such a problem. There was a study done around this. It was a Wall Street Journal article called Lessons from Brain Damaged Investors. And what they did is they did an investment contest where they found people who had damaged amygdalas versus people who had prefrontal cortex. So they were making all their decisions up front. And more or less, they cleaned the clock out of other investors. So it's just a good example of how these systems work. But it comes down to the advisor. We're the insulator when it comes to most people, the buffer from these decisions. And Vanguard has gone on record on a lot of studies around this. Advisor alpha is something we continue to hear. Does anyone know what the percent of advisor alpha is? 3 to 4%. And it's mostly behavior management. It's people management, not asset management. And we look at 2021, which is that benchmark year in Dalbar, the third worst year when we're talking about the delta between the quantitative analysis of investment behavior, average investor versus index. It's about 10%, but you add in that 3 or 4% on top of that, and all of a sudden we're talking about a much larger delta between the two. So definitely important to get advice, and it's about balance. Yep. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, and that's the major one. And actually, a lot of times it's holding on to winning investments, not necessarily panicking around bad investments. That's where you see the largest discrepancy occur. I think that's an important thought as we kind of move through the presentation. But it is about balance, future concept. This is the goals-based aspect of it, knowing where you want to go. And people are bad about framing their long-term goals. It's one of the biggest issues we get. It's why retirement savings tends to be one of the laggards when we talk about savings, because it's very irresolute. We don't even know how much we need into the future. How can I save for that? And I think as advisors, if you reframe this goal and talk about it in smaller bite-sized chunks, so instead of saying you want to have X saved when you're 65, you want to reframe this around much shorter time intervals, a year, 2 years, revisit it. You want to celebrate your successes here, but most people have no idea what their future even looks like. And the problem with our society here is we're a society of instant gratification. We're a society of instant gratification where we have impulsiveness that comes in and constantly draws the resources that we have committed to our long-term results and reapply them to short-term, unnecessary, oftentimes, needs. So this is the marshmallow experiment where you put two kids in a room, you give them a marshmallow and say, when I come back, you get two marshmallows. They always eat the marshmallow. It's that impulsiveness that comes in. But here, I think being a financial advisor and understanding that we can hack the mind, this can be very powerful. And actually, this is something I digress a little bit on or diverge from behavioral finance. There is a bias called mental accounting. Mental accounting, according to behavioral finance, is a mistake. I take task with that. I think it's one of the more powerful things that we can implement as financial advisors because it leans into something that's very intuitive to people. So the reason mental accounting is a mistake and what it is, mental accounting is taking your different assets and bucketing them, putting them into different pockets of money depending on how they're going to be used. Now, economics and behavioral finance will say mental accounting is a problem because a dollar is a dollar regardless of which pocket of money you put it in. However, what occurs is if you properly bucket money, the investments change behavior. Who here has a smartwatch? An Apple Watch or whatever they have on Fitbit? Does it change your behavior? Yeah, it generally does. How much so, I can't really say. It's not a great weight loss tool for a lot of people, but it is one of those things where if you have it, it does change the way you behave. And I would argue that investments are exactly the same. And we can see evidence of this as well. Your investments will change your behavior. Who knows, is a mutual fund more expensive than a variable annuity? On average. No. Mutual fund is cheaper. Which one provides a higher rate of return? So this is where it breaks down. According to Dalbar, they do another study, not the quantitative analysis of investor behavior, but they look at the same study for variable annuity subaccounts versus the average mutual fund investor. And what they found is even though the annuity by and large is more expensive, that annuity subaccount holders outperform mutual fund investors, which seems really counterintuitive. But when you think about it, it actually makes perfect sense. Because you think about a mutual fund. Mutual funds are used for an array of different needs. A lot of those needs can be short-term. A lot of those needs could be long-term. An annuity is a very specific investment used for a very specific purpose, the purpose of retirement, which is a long-term goal. So when you invest in an annuity, you actually have an impediment to access. You have the 59.5 penalty, oftentimes you have surrender. But what they found in this study is people were much longer holding their annuity subaccounts because of that impediment to access and purpose behind the investment. So having that purpose and matching up and bucketing investments to match purposes is a great way to modify behavior for clients. Longer term goals should be longer term assets, longer term investments, shorter term goals matched up against shorter term investments. That's one of those things where definitely doesn't make sense intuitively. When you think about it for a second, it makes complete sense and something that can be very easily implemented. And then of course we have materialism, and this is that decision making between something of high quality versus relative quality, and guiding people to make the right purchasing decisions from that standpoint is also important. Another one that I think is even more important than mental accounting is time-weighted return versus dollar-weighted return. Now, for a lot of people, this is something that they don't comprehend initially, but basically time-weighted return is the way we evaluate standard rates of return versus dollar rates of return, which are dollar-weighted or cash flow-weighted. So here, and I think this is important right now, because we're in a situation where our clients are getting older. You actually look at the average financial advisors. Anyone know how old the average financial advisor is across the United States? 55 to 58. 55 to 58. So we're getting older. But what about our clients? Does anyone want to guess the age of an average client that works with a financial advisor? You're really close, 64. So if the average client is 64, half of them being older than that, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about retirement. They're putting together a retirement income plan. They're filing for Social Security. They're enrolling in Medicare. They're thinking about all the different things that are going to crop up when they move through retirement, from estate planning to incapacity planning. All these different things come into play. It was extremely important. And when we retrospectively look at this retirement experiment of going from a DB-based retirement to a defined contribution plan retirement, we can look back over the last few years and see how we've actually done. And EBRI did this. This is the government data. The government looked at how people who retired 18 years ago have actually done it, drawing down their portfolios. I think an important concept here to think, though, is 70% of them are asset preservation oriented. I think that's always an important thought, because when we have that tipping point of going from accumulation into distribution, we think in the back of our mind that we want to have maximum utility of getting as much income as we possibly can out of a portfolio. But in practice and in preference, those people that are going in distribution don't operate that way. They operate from an asset preservation standpoint 70% of the time. The other 30% probably do want to draw down their portfolio as much as possible, but it starts to make a lot of sense. Because as you go into retirement, you're always watching your account value. Even though you may be in distribution, you're still accumulation oriented. You're always watching that number. And if that number starts to go awry, psychologically, you start to feel poor. So when we look back over these last 18 years of people who have gone through this new retirement, and we've seen their drawdown percentages, we can break it out into three broad groups. So the first group is $200,000 of accumulation or less. Do you want to guess the percent of drawdown that group has experienced as an aggregate percent? How much of their portfolio, their retirement assets have they drawn down? 25%, only 25%. So they still have the bulk of their assets left. They have $150,000 left. They probably should have saved more, but because income and spending tend to correlate in distribution, they're maintaining their balances as much as they possibly can, probably spending less during periods of turmoil. Now, the second demographic, $200,000 to $500,000, they have more means. What do you think their drawdown percent is over those 18 years? 27%, not a whole lot different. So they still have the bulk of their assets. And then the final demographic is 500,000 plus. What do you think their drawdown percent is? 11.8, 11.8%. So they still have the bulk of their assets left. What this suggests to me is that a lot of clients may be better served by spending more in retirement, especially those that are on the higher end of the spectrum. And they may need a financial advisor to get that permission to spend more in retirement. But you also see another couple interesting statistics that are brought out in that EBRI survey. They also looked at people who had pensions versus those that didn't. What do you think the drawdown percent of the aggregate pool of people who didn't have a pension was? 34%. So it was actually larger than those other demographic breakdowns. And then you look at people who have pensions. What do you think their drawdown percent was? 4%. So here, what this suggests is having those structured streams of income, the budgeting exercise in spending in retirement is important. So things like Social Security, things like pensions, things like annuities become important to structure out income. And I think even sometimes we fall into the trap of just doing baseline income when it comes to structured income. So just filling a spending gap. I would think even going at the top line and having an allowance or a bucket where you're actually spending at the top level to enable experiential spending is another thought that comes from this. It's going to be interesting to look back when we see a lot of the baby boomers go through the same exercise, because I will point out the statistics are using the silent generation, and the silent generation is generally very financially astute. And it's something that may completely change when we see the baby boomers go through this from a spending standpoint. Yes.
You just clarify what you said. It's totally real. You said people that go to people eventually
Oh, sorry. So people, yeah. So people without pensions were 34% drawdown. People with pensions only drew down 4%. So having that structured income, baseline income, has a positive effect on aggregate wealth. And I think that makes sense. It's probably what you would expect from the statistics. But that structured stream of income is important. Also, data definitely is perceived differently when we look at it from a top line number. Breaking it down, this is 2021. You see most of it was up. When we were down, it was Evergrande crisis. And that's where we saw a lot of people falter when it comes to that. And our job generally comes down a lot to education. I think there's a massive opportunity to reach back to the other demographics, the other generations to educate. So 34% of people only can pass a financial literacy test, a very basic one that everyone should be able to pass. So I think as a profession, there's a lot of opportunity to educate people on finances. And of course, all this comes down to choice architecture. It's up to us to provide the right coaching and giving clients choices in making those decisions. And that's the tipping point in behavioral finance. This is all about those decisions. We lay them out properly. One really easy thing to do, and you've probably employed this as well, is if you're trying to guide someone and persuading them to make a course of action, one very easy, just do the rule of three. Conservative, risky, middle option. Almost always they fall into that middle option, but oftentimes even taking this out of their hands. This is auto enrollment. This is negative consent. This is something that behavioral finance says when you set something up and it's automatic, it's very difficult for that person to break it. And that employing that trick for systematic savings also can be extremely beneficial. And then the words that we use with our clients, as I wrap up, these are always important. We did survey groups with Luntz Global on a periodic basis to come up with what clients actually want to hear from their financial advisors and what resonates with them. And these are the ones that stood out recently. They don't want products, they don't want a widget, they don't want a gadget, they want tools, services, and solutions. Our commitment rung very high. They want you to be committed to them. Additionally, what do you want your lifestyle to look like in 10 years is a good framing when we're talking about those long-term goals. I'm a doctor, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't talk to you about healthcare costs. They want healthcare costs. The number 2 things that 65-year-olds talk about as universal concerns every single year is running out of money and the cost of healthcare and retirement. So they definitely want this information from us. We have tons of it for you. I want you to help live life on your terms. So empowering them, I think a lot of it, again, comes down to that permission to spend to enable a better quality of life, because they may be much better off than they presume given their asset levels. It really comes down to Theodore Roosevelt and Maya Angelou, I think, said a very similar quote. It's not what you say, it's how you make people feel. And again, this comes down to that people management side to it. And this is providing those solutions in investing and helping people prepare for the unexpected. So in closing up, definitely a very rich topic. This is something that resonates with people, something when you employ properly in a goals-based approach around planning can drive a much better outcome, and just being mindful and trying to hack how people think and persuade them to do the right thing definitely works. And we've got you covered. We have those tools and resources to go through this connection exercise. So with that, I am all wrapped up. Any questions before we adjourn? I'm right on time.
Thank you, Ryan, very much. We'll take a short break and try to start our next program on the hour.
I have a Social Security conference call. Yeah, I know. That was the other half of the, yeah, it is. That's what I remember telling my daughter more and more. Yeah.